Hello, everybody, and welcome to this event where we're hosting Paul Gibbons, the author of The Science of Successful Organizational Change. My name is JP Manti. I work in Culture and Change here at Microsoft, and I had the pleasure of reading Paul's book and reaching out to Paul to try and ask him how some of his ideas might help us in our culture change here at Microsoft. And so that led to a series of extremely valuable and interesting conversations, and connected with Amy Draves to be able to host Paul here. So the really great thing from my perspective, as somebody who geeks out on a lot of this culture stuff, I read a lot of books, a lot of research, I follow a lot of experts. Paul's book and his thinking really influenced and changed the way I think about culture change and systems that drive human flourishing. And so it's a real honor and privilege to have Paul here today. Please welcome Paul Gibbons.
Thank you. Thanks, JP, and thanks, Amy, for making this happen, and thanks to Microsoft. I have to come clean. I'm having a kid in a candy store experience. Now, I grew up programming with computers and playing with computers, and Microsoft's been part of my life. Albeit I was in Europe, and so you're 6,000 miles away. It was a little inconvenient, but part of my life for one way or the other for almost 40 years or 35 years now. How old is Microsoft, by the way? 1979, was it?
39, yes.
39 years old?
75.
Fabulous. It's great to be here. I wrote this book, and I hope you'll avail yourself of one of the discounted copies. And if you can't do that, I hope you avail yourself of one of the very, very expensive copies that are on sale afterwards. I had an argument with my publisher. I submitted this book in the end of 2013. And she called me up one afternoon. She said, I've got some bad news for you. I want you to take out a section. And so at great personal risk, I'm going to put that section into this talk because I think it's something that I want to say that she felt would be too controversial. So perhaps it may or may not be controversial to you. And the title of the section was, "Is all this talk about happiness making us miserable?" So everywhere you look, we have happiness screaming at us from the bookshelves in Barnes & Noble with smiling people with beautiful smiles and tans, both telling us that happiness is important and also telling us how to get it. And I don't think that either of those two things are necessarily true. There are lots of ways to define the value of a life. The Greek philosophers talked about virtues and the good life as being the virtuous life. Now that sounds very moralistic today, but they didn't mean moralism in the sense that we might use it today. They meant courage, prudence, temperance, piety, rationality and reason, freedom, friendship. Those were the things to the Greeks that were constitutive of the good life and not being happy. And so I invite us to conduct a thought experiment. Does someone summiting Everest, are they happy? Is that the first thing you think of? Did Mother Teresa organize her time around being happy? Nelson Mandela? Environmental activists who are trying to make the world a better place, at least in their mind. Are they happy? Is that how they think about things? What about a school teacher? What about the parent of a sick child or caring for a sick friend? Does that make people happy? And so by narrowly defining the good life in terms of happiness, I think, and this is one contribution also from the Greeks, is the more you try and seek happiness, the more unhappy you'll be. And one of the things I do say in the book, I think is quite entertaining, there's no more guarantee of unhappiness is comparing yourself to someone and thinking that you ought to be happier, that they're happier than you, or you ought to be as happy as them. So I think it's an error, and we have good news, though. The psychologists in the last 15 years of the 21st century, if you want, have come up with a notion that's really close to what the Greeks did 2,500 years ago, and it's called human flourishing. Now, how many people have heard of human flourishing? It's made its way into the... Of course, the OD consultants all have. All the hands got shot up in the air. So perhaps this will be of some interest. Human flourishing is the notion that, yes, happiness is important, but you don't get happy by focusing on happiness. So there are 4 other dimensions to human flourishing as contemporary psychologists think of it. One of them is spiritual fulfillment, but that effectively means doing meaningful work, work that matters, work that makes a difference. The second thing is doing work that engages you fully, that uses the maximum of your human capabilities. The third thing is having nurturing and productive relationships. Nothing predicts well-being and wellness more than having great relationships. The Harvard Health Study, one of the largest cohorts ever studied, that was the predictor of longevity and wellness rather than other outcomes. And so, and then finally, achievement. We're human beings. We are drawn to achieve, to climb the Everest, to go to the moon, to build corporations and cathedrals. That's one of the things we do. And so if you look at all 5 of those dimensions, you begin to get a rounder picture of what the good life might be. So this is a talk about business, and it's a talk to business people. And so why do I mention that? Is that the question I have, and I think is a question I'm dissatisfied with the answer, is work and workplaces, as currently designed, are they designed to promote human flourishing? Is that one of the things that we take seriously when we build corporations today? And the answer is I don't think we do. I think people, as human beings, one of the things that makes work valuable is that it has special meaning for us. Do we design workplaces around meaning for people? Do we design workplaces so that people are maximally engaged? So that we're using 80, 90%, 100%, 110% of what people are capable. The exhilaration of using all of yourself. One psychologist, a guy called Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the most unpronounceable name in psychology, Hungarian name, defined flow experience. You know, sports athletes talk about being in the zone. Chess players talk about being in the zone when the ball is this big. So he defined flow experience as when you're using so much of your own capacities, the world disappears. It almost becomes a meditation or Zen-like. So maximal engagement. And then are we designing workplaces for relationships, for networks and communities? Are we designing workplace where politicking and infighting and, we design workplaces that are deleterious to the formation of human relationships? Are we designing workplaces so that human beings can achieve things that matter to them? And I think largely the answer is no. Largely we design businesses with other things in mind. And so one provocation I have is that we ought to be thinking more about designing businesses around human flourishing. So the 3 more, if you'll permit me a little bit more of a philosophical digression before I go into science and organizational change, which is, as we say in England, what it said on the tin. So my further philosophical digressions are, if that's one thing that we ought to design businesses around, is human flourishing. Here's 3 more. The thing that I love most in life is science. I think science is one of the things that dignifies human civilization. Science, art, we can name a few other things. And unfortunately, science by itself, without business, would stay on the laboratory bench or in obscure journals that no one ever reads. Business, to my mind, insofar as we're able to bring technology and science for the betterment of human beings, the 7.4 billion on the people, it's businesses who perform that role. And that to me is a sacred role. That to me is the job that businesses does, scaling science and technology. The other thing, and this is a notion that comes from Karl Marx, who's not the most read management thinker in the canon, not terribly popular in the United States. Although Donald Trump, I'm sure, is considering adopting some of his philosophies, probably not. So he had the notion, check this out as a notion, that work was what dignified us as human beings. And there was enormous dignity, not just in working, though, in working together. That's what we did incredibly specially and differently as human beings, is come together to create magical, wonderful things that none of us can do by ourselves. And in our culture, unfortunately, we glorify the individual rather too much. And we don't think about, to do anything of any value in a complex world today, for the most part, you need gangs of people, whether it be cathedrals or computers or the International Space Station or the internet or whatever it is. So workplaces ought to be places where human beings can come together to create magic that we can't do by ourselves. And then the final thing is businesses, and this is my great hope for the 21st century, ought to do things that are of value to humankind. So when I think about that, one of the things I think about is if you had an individual, if you had a very dear friend who was brilliant and talented, and you saw them wasting their life with the trivial and the mundane, It'd be really disappointing to you, would it not? Well, as I look at, if you look at human civilization, if you take that a step further, if you look at what we do as a civilization, with all the talent and the brilliance and the energy and the vision and the imagination of which humans are capable, and you look at the things on which we squander some of our intellectual resources, are we working on the right things? Do we need thousands of people to design a new kind of toothpaste? Yeah. Do we need all of the economic energy and all the vitality of our civilization? Is enough of that pointed towards things that increase human flourishing, human well-being around the world? And I think the answer is clearly no. And we ought to be able to, and this is a great hope for the 21st century, design economic structures, and that includes business, that promote human wellness, human flourishing in ways that we don't, and redirect our energy towards things that matter, and redirect our energy away from the trivial, away from the mundane, away from the banal, and away from the vulgar. I'm using that word and the way that Latins use it, the base, if you will. And so that's a great hope that I have. And so with those philosophical reflections, and that was the bit that got struck from my book by the editor all those 18 months ago. So I hope that wasn't too tedious. If I may talk about something that is in the book, it's about behavioral change. And if I may be overly blunt, we suck at behavioral change. We're really, really bad. We're really, really bad as individuals. We're really, really bad as businesses. And we're really, really bad as a society. And so, this first, I had an idealized notion when I was 33 about how people might change. It was, if we had enough reasons, enough rationality, this is an Aristotelian notion, we would automatically change. And so I was a little disappointed. I became a management consultant in 1993. I went to work for a British bank called Barclays Bank. We designed a risk management framework. I was the mathematician on the team, and I wrote 150 pages full of equations. We wrote 2,400 pages worth of report for Barclays Bank in England. We charged them $4 million. It was a nice little living back in the day. They did nothing with it. Nothing. It landed on a shelf, and eventually it found its way into bottom drawers, and then from bottom drawers it found its way into circular filing cabinets. This is an extraordinary thing, I thought, because I was an idealistic manager, because I thought this guy's going to make a difference. Silly me. In fact, they did nothing with it. And what Barclays failed to do was to mind the gap between thinking something is a good idea and actually doing it. There's a pretty big gap. And in corporations, we ought to be able to align our behaviors with our strategies, with our intentions, with our plans. It's a tricky thing, and we're not too good at it. And so most people who are comment on organizational change would say the thing that damns lots of organizational change is the inability to change behaviors. And so if you'll permit me a personal anecdote, in 1980, I was working in a laboratory at the University of Wisconsin. I was studying cancer. And I apologize in advance to the people who are animal rights people or anti-vivisectionist people. Anyway, I was experimenting on little white mice. It was 1980, I didn't know any better. Anyway, so I'm experimenting on little white mice, and I'm giving little white mice cancer. And I'm studying the effect of the drug that I'm giving them on RNA and DNA synthesis. It's interesting work, right? And, the noblest outcome from that work, we understand DNA and RNA synthesis and the effect of this toxin on mice, and we help, design a cure for cancer. It's not without noble purpose. And the toxin that I was administering to the mice came from cigarette smoke. It's called dimethylbenzanthracene, and it's a big polycyclic hydrocarbon, and it gives mice cancer. It gives human beings cancer too. And so what I used to do is I used to do my experiments, and I used to go out in the parking lot and smoke. And for 20 years, I smoked a pack of Marlboro Red a day. So here I was, producing cancer research firsthand, with my, all my rational faculties at my disposal, one would think, and then going out and having a smoke, ingesting the same thing, which I saw delivering cancer before my very eyes. It's a strange thing, isn't it? So by the mid of the 90s, I wanted to quit smoking. And then again, I was confronted with behavioral change and the gap between intentions and actions, what I wish to do with my life and how I wish to live my life and how my life actually looks. And as society, it's a sad thing about the obesity epidemic in the United States and partly worldwide. where people can afford to eat. But it's a sad thing about the obesity, and 95% of people who are obese want to lose weight. It's an enormous public health program, but it's not a public health problem that people are sincere in their intention, wanting to be thinner for whatever reason. Only 5% lose 10% of their body weight in a given year, and of those, many of those relapse the year after. This is a sad thing. So as a society and as individuals, and as corporations, we're really, really bad at behavioral change. And behavioral change matters. What comes out of people's mouths, their intentions, is a beautiful thing. But if their behaviors don't line up, what have you got? You've got, I believe the technical term for it is BS. The gap between what we desire and what we want and what we think is important and what we're actually able to do. So why does this come about is an interesting question. And if you'll forgive yet another philosophical digression, it goes back to the history of ideas and the history of psychology. So psychology used to be part of philosophy. And then about 1900, a group of experimental psychologists began to do psychological experiments. So it became a science in its own right. In my view, it became a science in a way that chemistry became a science in 1650. Yeah, still super primitive, still a lot of pseudoscience, still a lot of hokum, still a lot of myth, still a lot of pop psychology corrupting psychological science as it is. But anyway, we have psychological science in the early part of the last century. A couple of guys called B.F. Skinner and J.B. Watson, perhaps you've heard of them. Their ideology or their methodological approach to psychology was called behaviorism. And you'll recognize some words from behaviorism. You'll recognize stimulus and response, rewards and punishment, carrots and sticks. So those are all behaviorist notions. And every time you punish a child with what we call the naughty step in England, what do you call it in America? What do you call the naughty step in America? You put a kid down, timeout. Timeout, is that what you call it? You call it timeout. Every time you incarcerate a criminal to change their behavior, ostensibly, you're endorsing a behaviorist philosophy, which is that human beings change their behavior in response to environmental stimuli, punishments and rewards. Every time you compensate an executive with stock options, ostensibly to increase their performance, you're endorsing a behaviorist notion, a behaviorist philosophy. And as you can see, some of that legacy persists today. So it was largely discredited intellectually in the 60s and 70s. Methodologically, it wasn't very robust. It's also coercive. So anytime you try and coerce someone with a reward or a sanction or a punishment, you're indifferent to their internal states, their mind, their thoughts, their feelings. So behaviorism was coercive. So enter the really, really cuddly, hippie 60s in the time of humanistic psychology, and what we decided in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that to change behavior, you wanted to change thoughts and feelings first. That makes sense, right? You want to change people's insides to change their outsides. How many people have heard something like that? Change your insides to change your outsides is some sort of psychological mantra? Okay. And so that's what we do. So I'm a change consultant for my sins for the last 20 years. I've been in organizations helping create behavioral change on my good days, not so much on my bad days. So I'm in organizations, we're trying to change, and generally speaking, I don't do it through carrots and sticks. I do it through inspiration, vision, business cases, rationality on one dimension, you might say, and emotions on another dimension. And so that's the model of how we change behavior that we inherited from the 60s and 70s and 80s. So the question is, does it work? Well, there are two problems. Who's ever had a fight on Facebook with someone from an ideological opposite? Come on now, get those hands up. You all have Donald Trump friends on your Now, who has ever presented this friend with facts to contradict their point of view? You have. What was your experience of doing so?
Pretty much. Well, actually, I've had some positive experiences.
You had some positive experiences. That makes
Not usually, though.
Not usually. Who else has been able to change someone's mind with the presentation of fact? Doesn't really work, right? Well, anyway, so this dude at Michigan State University, his name is Brendan Nyhan. He's a professor there in the Department of Public Policy. Brendan Nyhan talks about something called the backfire effect. So the backfire effect is, this won't surprise anybody who's ever had a fight on Facebook, right? If you provide someone whose reasoning is what we call in psychology motivated reasoning, emotive reasoning, if you prevent someone who's ideologically committed with facts, you know what happens to their opinion? They strengthen it. Isn't that an extraordinary thing? You know, the climate change deniers and the anti-vaxxers and the world full of people who embrace all the... You think when we had science at our disposal and we presented it in front of people, beautifully arrayed in front of them, they ought to say, thank you. Thank you for the benefit of your wisdom. I shall change immediately. It doesn't really happen that way. So, but even let's say in organizations, we are able to change hearts and minds, right? So we are. So say I'm a super duper charismatic leader. I'm a fantastic change manager. I'm really good at creating intellectual, rational business cases. I'm super duper good at inspiration and motivating. I involve my stakeholders really, really well. I'm beginning to change hearts and minds. So say I do that super well. Do behaviors follow? Well, do they? Not nearly often enough. Because as we've discussed and as we've explored and as most of us know from our own experience, there's a gap between what people want to do, what they desire, what's in their heads, what comes out of their mouth, and what they're able to do. And so that model, that two-step model, is fraught with problems. So here we are, we've come through the 20th century and we come into the 21st century. This would be a horrible talk. You know, there's a guy come in from England and all he did was tell us about all horrible things that don't work in the world. So let me tell you about some things that do work in the world. But I want to preface it by saying the following. We haven't won the game of changing behaviors, not by any stretch of the imagination. So when I said that the social sciences are like chemistry was in the 1650s, I wasn't kidding. You know, my impression of the social sciences is we're still groping around. We need a certain amount of humility about what we find out in the social sciences. But there are some things we're learning. And it's something I call in the book neobehaviorism. Ever, like most authors today, ever after the neologism, which makes you seem, just sets you apart from the crowd. So my neologism is neobehaviorism. And the way it works, well, I'm going to give you 3 examples of the way it works. So one neobehaviorist idea comes from a guy who's spoken here, I think, recently. You guys have had Charles Duhigg in recently. So he's got a super book, brilliant book, practical book, lots of insights. I won't try and comment on his, overall an excellent contribution. So there's some 3 things about habits change. His book's called The Power of Habit that we need to know. And these are super practical. So one is motivation isn't your friend. So we all think in order to change our habits, we need to motivate. Motivation is like this. Motivation is related to arousal of the sympathetic nervous system. Yeah, so that's one thing. Our state of how much excitement we feel. No, not that kind of arousal. No, not that. No, the other kind of arousal that physiologists talk about. And it's also related to the narratives we have, which change. Yeah, so our level of arousal and the narratives they produce our motivation. Well, that's up and down. Some days you're feeling it, and some days you're not. So when you have a habit, habits tend to transcend motivation. And so the very powerful idea in books like The Power of Habit is once you get the habit, your motivation can do what it likes, but you have the habit. So that's one thing. And there are 2 really super duper practical tips. One is mini habits. And I think this is a fascinating idea. So if you start really, really small, what does your intuition tell you if you meditated, say, 5 minutes a day for 6 days consecutively, or you meditated 1 day for 30 minutes? Which is better? What does your intuition tell you? Every day. How come?
Habit.
Because you're building a habit. Yeah. And after 30 or 45 or 60 repetitions, roughly speaking, it'll be ingrained. And, I know people, a guy who's been meditating for 20 years. This guy cannot go to bed without meditating. He just can't. It's for like brushing his teeth. It's like feels weird to him. And so once you have a habit like that, your motivation may fluctuate as it will, but you have a habit. So mini habits is an excellent way to get yourself in the game. The second way is a 30-day challenge. And this is something that's really, really fun to do in your own lives, in your personal lives, in your professional lives, is take on a 30-day challenge. So I use an example from my experience as a parent. So if I said to my son, I want you to do 30 minutes extra math until you finish high school, which is 6 more years, right? He'd look at me as if I was from Mars, and it would be a fight every single day. But we set a challenge in April. We said, look, you want to do really well on this test in May? Here's the deal. Let's do a 30-day challenge. Do 30 minutes on Khan Academy every day for 30 days, and then you're done. You know what? He doesn't suffer about it at all. He comes straight home from school, he throws down his bag, he does a 30 minutes con, he gets on with his life. We're done with 30 days, and you know what he said? I'd like to do another 30-day challenge. And this one he's going to write for 15 minutes a day. He has a certain amount of talent in creative writing. So a 30-day challenge is long enough so you begin to get the habit, but it's short enough so it doesn't feel like a life sentence, right? It doesn't feel like, oh, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. How am I possibly going to manage, right? So those are really two, I think, super duper practical things that we can think about when we want to change habit. So there's two more things in the area of neobehaviorism that we can think about when we change behaviors in the 21st century. One is called choice architecture. Has anybody read a book called Nudge? Anybody? 1, 2, 3, 4, half a dozen of you. That's tremendous. I think it's one of the most important books I think that's been written in the last 15 or 20 years. And I think its power has not even begun to be tapped. So Thaler and Sunstein wrote a book called Nudge. And they are employed, in fact, the UK government has actually got a nudge team. I think they call it the Behavioral Insights Team, using what I'm about to describe in public policy, which is evidence-based public policy. So making public policy in accord with what the science would tell us, which is a strange thing, you know, strange thing, especially living in the time we do, because public policy is determined by what? Ideology, politics, dogmatism, habit, ritual, whatever you want. Certainly not rational, right? Certainly not evidence-based. So this book, the Behavioral Insights Team, are really working hard to create evidence-based changes in public policy based on this idea of nudge. So what's the idea of nudge? The idea of nudge is you can shape people's behaviors by changing the environment. Okay, that's not super duper radical. Shape their behaviors by changing the environment, but the great thing about it is you leave them at liberty to choose. So in a sense, it's not coercive. It's certainly not as coercive as rewards and sanctions. Punish them if they do it and reward them if they do the opposite, right? It's not that coercive. So here's an example. If I'm a school cafeteria manager and I want the children to eat in a more healthy way, I can put, research shows, the healthy food at eye level, or I could put it early in the line. So by the time they get to the Doritos and the pizzas down here and the Coca-Colas, they got a full tray. So that makes sense, right? And research shows that's what they do. They pick the stuff that's eye level and early on the line. So I can array the choices, the choice architecture it's called, of the lunch line, either so they eat more healthily, but how else could I arrange those choices? So I make more money, so I could do the high margin stuff up front, the Doritos and the Coca-Cola and the pizzas and the processed food. I could do the older food that's about to expire, like they do in supermarkets. They put the old stuff at the front. But one of the things I can do using choice architecture is promote healthy choices, but the kids can still have as much pizza and Doritos as they want. But I'm making it easier for them to make the right choices. So that's choice architecture in a nutshell, is changing the environment. And there have been lots of experiments done in various spheres in it. I still think it hasn't reached deeply into the organization development, change management, organizational behavior world. I just don't think organizational change practitioners who do what I do for a living are paying enough attention to some of these ideas. And perhaps we are here. I mean, perhaps it'll be an interesting conversation here. So some of the things they've done is most people save far too little. So even when there's free money on the table, like an employer contributes to your 401k, they match the contribution or some percentage of the contribution, people leave that money on the table. They don't take up this 401k option. So one of the interesting experiments, and again, the wonderful thing about this is you can measure results. They ran an education program for this side of the room on savings, the virtue of savings. They had a financial wizard, wise guy up there telling people they ought to save more. And 401k enrollments went up 7%. Now on this side of the room, they used choice architecture, which is basically arraying the choices in a way that was pro-savings, if you will, 100% increase. So here is education trying to change hearts and minds and hoping that behavior follows. And here is choice architecture. And so one of the other striking examples for this is organ donation. So some places in the world, they have like 95% organ donation, like Austria, right? You know why? You know why? You have to opt out. You're an organ donor unless you say you don't want to. Ooh, that's too gross, right? But in the United States, mostly you have to opt in. Now, some states have switched from opt-in to opt-out. You know what happens? It goes from like 10% to 90%. That's choice architecture at work, because you can change the default settings. So those are some ideas, and I think, again, these are things that we're still learning how to do. This book only came out in, well, I think Nudge came out in 2009 or 2011. So it's a relatively recent idea, and it's gaining a lot of popularity, I think, thankfully, in the right circles. And so the very last idea on behavioral change that I'll close with is called behavioral specificity. So we think about resistance to change in a really weird way. It's a concept that is all throughout the organization development change management literature, is resistance to change. And so the way I was taught it when I went through this huge investment in my education as a change guy in 1995, is that resistance to change was either they objected to the rationality of the proposal, so they thought it was a bad idea intellectually, it's possible, or they had some emotional response. So they were afraid, they were angry, they were threatened in some way. So that's entirely too narrow a way to look at resistance to change. So we've already talked about one way that people resist change is because it's habit. It's not that they don't want to. It's not that they don't think it's a good idea. It's not that they're not motivated. They have habits to do otherwise. But we don't think about resistance to change enough in the organization development, the change management community, is how do I change people's habits? And that's really the way we want to think. When we work in culture, we think of culture, I'm going to be super controversial here, as the words that comes out of people's mouth, and that is really, really the tip of the culture iceberg. Because you know what? There's not a lot of correspondence between what comes out of people's mouth and the behaviors they actually follow. Do you know, if you ask me what my values are, I sound like a Boy Scout. Yeah? Really? Do I live like that? No, absolutely not. I don't do anything like horribly immoral or anything. I just want to hasten to add, but it's not like a life full of integrity and vitality, honesty and thrifty and service. I mean, I would love it if it were, but it's not. You know, I'm very human in design. But if you do values surveys in organizations, we frequently try and change culture in organizations through changing what comes out of people's mouths. And we do spend a lot of money. There's a huge industry. It's probably $1 billion industry, I think, assessing culture in organizations. I think it's a waste of money because you're assessing what comes out of people's mouths, and then to change it, then you try and change what comes out of people's mouths. And I just don't think, so if you look at culture as a collection of habits, as a collection of rituals, everything from the way we conduct meetings to the way we respond to emails. If you look at things like that, culture is a collection of behaviors, well, then there's something tangible and meaningful that you can change. And so I think the culture change industry needs a little shaken up. And so hopefully that's not too offensive to, I hope there's no one who makes their living doing culture surveys in the room. So those are two ideas on, I think, the way we need to think more about behaviors in organizations. And when I've seen change fail, it's inevitably because people didn't spend enough time thinking about the behaviors that were going to make the change go. They didn't spend enough time helping the users use the system, helping the people in a restructured organization, helping them behave differently, which is what really matters. And so, you know, my career, my early change management career was peppered with examples of trying to go in and try and change behavior in organizations and finding often that we'd been called in too late, and that people were already leaving in droves, and that they were trying to restructure an organization without thinking at all about changing behaviors or changing people's minds or changing people's cultures. So it's with all of this stuff on behavioral change, I want to speak with a certain amount of humility. You know, if someone says, oh, you're an expert in change, I almost blush or cringe inside, because I don't think, you know, our idea about what an expert isn't someone who's skeptical or humble or much of a learner. We think of an expert as a guy, like the answer guy. And I certainly, in the world of behavioral change, don't want to present myself as an answer guy, just because I think in the 21st century, the answers haven't been found. But there are some encouraging things. And I think we need to focus more on behaviors and less on hearts and minds. Now, people say, that sounds super duper callous. I don't mean it to be callous. What people feel and what they think has value in its own right. Not just because it's a way to get them to do what you want. So I think there is a place for engagement and for hearts and minds, and for having people and organizations committed to the mission and rationally committed to the business case of the organization. But I think that's a value in its own right. And I think we can change behaviors in a way we need to involve them, for sure, in changing hearts and minds, but we can't assume ever that behaviors will necessarily follow. So I painted, I hope, something of an optimistic picture at the end. I mean, we're learning a great deal about behavioral change in the 21st century. And I think if we're going to create the kind of corporations, the kind of businesses that I'd like to see, I think the kind of businesses that Microsoft would like to become, communities where people come together to do magical things that they couldn't do by themselves, places where we can scale science and technology for the benefit of humankind, 7.4 billion people on the planet, places where we nurture relationships and where nature grow, and where structures that don't have people fighting for resources politically with one another. If we can structure organizations and decisions in organization around evidence, it would be a wonderful thing. And if we started to work on more things that valued, human beings and organizations, you want people to engage with their work and to find meaning in their work. Why don't you do stuff that values? And I submit, this is perhaps too judgmental a thing to say, but, spending thousands of people trying to launch the 200th kind of toothpaste in the world is frittering away of the amazing capability that human beings have in the world, their imagination, their intellect, their creativity, their ability to work together to create. We've done amazing things, The pyramids were built, how long ago were they built? 3,000 years ago or something like that. That's a long time. What are we doing today that looks like a pyramid? What are we doing today that looks like Notre Dame Cathedral? Because those were monuments to the maximum of what we could achieve with art and science and architecture in the time. What are the cathedrals that we're building today? What are the important projects that are going to dignify us in 200, 300, and 500 years? People are going to look back and say, look what those guys did. It's an extraordinary thing. And so I'd like business to spend more time thinking about that and a lot less time thinking about the thousands of different kinds of toothpaste, which I'm not sure we need. So anyway, thank you. Thank you for your patience and grace.